Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hello. It's Jessa here, back with another episode of Better Sex. So glad you're here listening. I'm here every week doing this because I think sex and relationships are really important. And if I can bring some information or inspiration or thought-provoking interviews that make a difference for you, then I will be happy. I do wonder sometimes who's listening. You know, I'm sitting here in basically what's a closet recording these shows. I'm talking to expert guests. I get to interact with those people. And then I send this out in the world, and I really don't know what kind of impact I'm having. So I'm going to ask you to please leave a comment. You know, give me some feedback on iTunes or on my website, wherever it is you're listening to this. I would love to hear from you. What do you think so far? What has moved you? What has been helpful? What have you been disappointed by? You know, do you have other things you'd like to know? You know, please interact with me. Let me know you're out there so that I can continue trying to bring you stuff that's going to be helpful to you in building your intimate relationship over time. And by the way, you could submit a question on bettersexpodcast.com. There is a little icon on the bottom of every page that allows you to record a question. So I could play that anonymously and answer it on the air on an episode. Or you could email me. Send me an email. Ask a question. I'd be happy to address it on an episode if I feel like it's relevant for people. I'd love to hear from you. So please get in touch. Today's episode is an interview with another researcher, done a few of these recently, whose work is based on sexual fluidity. And originally with women, she was specifically following women in their sexual, their identification, their sexual orientation, and how they labeled themselves over time. Although, as she shares with us today, she's coming to see that this is actually a human phenomenon, not just female. But she's got a wonderful take on our human need to categorize other people and ourselves, while at the same time realizing that that's not the reality. You know, our human existence is complex. So we try to categorize as a way to handle all the information we've got. And yet we don't really fit labels, not 100%. So the idea that we have sexual fluidity, that we are not, you know, gay, straight, bi necessarily. We may have experiences that fall outside of what we would expect. And that's totally normal. So Lisa Diamond is a professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah. Her research focuses on the development and dynamic expression of sexual identity and orientation over the life course. She studies the influences of early life experiences on psychosocial and psychosexual development and the biological mechanisms through which intimate relationships shape mental and physical health. I'm just so happy she took the time to have this conversation with me today, and I hope you enjoy it. So Lisa, thank you so much for being with me today.
Real pleasure.
Could we start off where you just talk a little bit about what got you into your field and what interested you about sex and sexuality?
You know, I entered graduate school in human development in the early 90s, and I was specifically interested in studying lesbian and gay youth. And again, that was a relatively new field in the early 90s. It was like they just discovered that teenagers could be gay.
Right.
And at that time, most of what I was reading all the literature and sort of getting up to speed, and everything that I could find that was published was about young men and not young women. And as a feminist, and also as someone who was trying to figure out, you know, what's going to be my entry point into this field, because that's what you're told to do as a graduate student, is to find
right.
thing. So my first thought was really, where are the women, and what are women's experiences, and are they different from men's, and why have they been, unrepresented? And so that was really what got me into it. And so I didn't necessarily even think of myself as a sexuality researcher. I just thought of myself as sort of a developmental psychologist, interested in lesbian and gay youth, and trying to understand the developmental experiences of young women.
Okay. So how did that shape your research? I don't know if you want to describe a little bit the kind of research you've done. And
what I did, for my very first study was I just started this interview project where I recruited young women who were non-heterosexual in some way. I didn't require that they openly identify as anything. And I targeted, relatively young women between the ages of 16 and 23. And my goal was to just sort of interview them in depth about their histories of identification, but then also follow them over time, which had never been.
Right.
What I found was that there was kind of a shocking amount of variability in the way that they identified their sexuality and in their sort of patterns of attraction and behavior. And so that's what started me sort of thinking about this concept of sexual fluidity and thinking about sexual orientation as not as categorical a phenomenon as had previously been thought. And what is interesting is that now there's a lot of evidence that men are quite fluid too. I initially thought, well, maybe this is a distinctively female thing, but there's a lot of evidence that it's not. It's still unclear whether it's much more common in women, whether it's more common at all in women, or whether it's just that women are given more permission to express themselves that way. But at the time, I really thought of it as a uniquely female thing. And over the years, I've come to think that actually it's more of a human thing.
Okay. So could you speak to that fluidity a little bit? Like, what does that mean?
So I define it as a capacity to respond erotically to a broader range of stimuli and people than are necessarily a part of your own sexual orientation. So we think about lesbians are attracted to women, heterosexual women are attracted to men, and then bisexuals are attracted to both, and that it's very categorical. And yet what I found over time in my research is that some of the lesbians would have one-time only attractions to women, and one-time only attractions to men, and some of the women would have one-time only attractions to women, and that it didn't mean that they were all bisexual. What it meant is that their overall pattern, their overall orientation didn't provide the last word on all of their sexual experiences.
So at this point, how do you distinguish or maybe define, sexual orientation versus fluidity versus, bisexuality versus flexibility?
It's a common question. And I still think to some degree, we're still trying to figure that out. Probably one of the most common questions I get is, what's the difference between fluidity and bisexuality?
Yeah.
If it's this capacity to respond erotically to someone who is not your preferred gender, well, you could think about that as a version of bisexuality. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the important distinctions is that among the bisexual women that I've studied and that I've talked to over the years, they have a very consistent pattern of attraction to both sexes. That it's been a long-standing part of the way they experience their erotic life.
Okay.
And for the fluid lesbians and the fluid heterosexuals that I've talked to, it's much more sporadic and it's much more context dependent, that they're not constantly interested in the non-preferred gender. It's a very fleeting and sometimes pretty sporadic thing. And so I think although it may manifest itself in the same way, which is occasional attractions and behavior with both sexes, it seems to sort of come from a different place. And for bisexuals, it's a very constant pattern of attraction to both sexes. And for individuals whose attractions are generally polarized, but who have this capacity for fluidity, it may very rarely, kind of pop up and shape what they actually feel or do. And so I think That's one way to understand the difference.
Okay. Because I'm also aware, people that identify as bisexual, it's not like they're 50-50, right? Male and female. It's like,
I think that's a really important point, that most bisexual identified individuals see themselves as leaning one way or another. And this goes back to Kinsey. Kinsey was the one to introduce the Kinsey Scale. So you know what? It's not just homosexual, heterosexual. There's a whole kind of gradation that
right.
along. And so you can roughly distinguish between people who are really far on one end or the other, and then people who fall in that middle kind of bisexual zone, but who still have a preference for one or another.
Right.
And I think the other thing that complicates things is that if you do fall into that middle zone, the simple capacity to have attractions to both sexes kind of opens up a lot more possibility for change over time. If you are already attracted to both women and men, then your attractions are likely to be pushed around a little bit more by who you happen to come into contact with. How appealing are the women and men that you see? And so change is going to be a more ever-present part of your erotic landscape because you always have the capacity for both. And that's another sort of complicating factor.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like the people that experience fluidity versus bisexual identified, they experience it as an exception, right? Like it feels like an exception instead of just.
And often they would say things like, I'm generally like, I'm not attracted to men, but this guy, it's almost like he's like a woman in a man's body. It's like I just get along. Like there's something about him, like it's kind of a wacky thing. Like I'm not attracted to men. I'm just attracted to this man.
Yeah.
Well, women would say the same thing. Like I know I'm attracted to men. I don't know what's going on with this woman, but something about her, right? And some of the women that I studied actually, there's one woman in particular who said that, she ended up falling in love with her best female friend and her roommate. And they had this really close relationship, and they would always cuddle on the couch together. They were in college, and one night it just sort of spilled over, and they were, kissing and having sex, and they ended up having this like 2-year affair with each other. And they were both completely confused, and they would actually like go to like the local park and try to find other women that they were attracted to, because they were confused. They were like, it doesn't make sense that you're the only, like, if we're attracted to each other and we're women, doesn't that mean we should be attracted to other women? But no, I'm only attracted to you. And they were like trying to find other women that they were attracted to, and they couldn't. It was something about their relationship and their bond and their connection. And it didn't generalize really, really broadly.
Yeah.
And I followed that woman, for over 20 years, and she never had another relationship with a woman. She ended up getting married to a man and having kids. She doesn't regret the experience. She doesn't think it was like crazy. She was like, that was a really great, wonderful thing, but it was a one-time thing.
Huh. All right, so are you still following the women from your original research?
I am.
Wow. Okay.
It's been, I started that study in 1995.
Yeah. That's amazing.
It's been over 20 years, which is really amazing because a lot of them have kids now. They've gone through marriages and divorces and all of the things that life inevitably hands you.
Yeah.
And it's been a real privilege to see how changes in sexuality intersect with some of those other changes in life.
Hey, I'm just taking a quick little break in the middle of the show. Most of you probably know, if you've been listening at all, that I have written a new book called Sex Without Stress. But what you may not know is that I have developed an online course to support you through the process. The book has a lot in it. It's a do-it-yourself process to totally transform your sex life, but it's hard to do it. And it's hard to do it alone without support. So I have been looking for a way to create an environment that's supportive and could help you actually get the stuff done. So what I've done is create an 8-week course. There are webinars that you can watch live or you can watch later. There's materials, there are exercises and directions, and then I'm going to offer live online office hours. This is where you can get questions answered and get input on your situation. It's not therapy, but it's a place to come and help you move through the process. The next cohort starts January 28th, 2019, taking enrollment all the way up until then. You can learn more at sexwithoutstress.com. Easy to find the online course information there if you want some more information. I would love to have you join me. All right, so this is making me think I'll come back to some of the other questions I had, because now I'm wondering, what are you finding in your research following these women now and some of these other life influences? Has this opened up new questions to investigate? You know, it must have, that you weren't even thinking when you set out.
I think a lot of it is, and I guess this is inevitable. And it's also been interesting because, you know, when I started this study, I was also very young. I was similar. I was not that much older than my participants. And I think something that everyone who gets older realizes is that there's a certain amount of hardship and tragedy and loss that's just a part of living.
Yeah.
Things don't go the way you thought they would. People leave your life. People die. People
Right.
get sick.
Right.
And so when my respondents were much younger, they're, you know, figuring out their sexual identity was like a big priority in their lives. And as it was for me when I was young and coming out. And then as life goes on, other things loom so much larger. Your work, your parents, your marriage. And so some of the women who've been really honest with me about some of the tragedies that have happened to them, the tragedies of life. And it becomes clear that over time, you know, the sexual identity stuff kind of fades away. And you know, there is a humanness to everyone. But there are also some interesting ways it works out. So one of the lesbian identified women who had a really stable relationship for the entire time she'd been in the study. She married her girlfriend and they were like rock solid. And, you know, when I interviewed her at the 20-year point, she told me that, you know, she and her wife went on vacation with their two best friends, another lesbian couple, and her wife and one of the members of the other couple started an affair. And it ended up ending the marriage.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God. And this like longtime lesbian was like, and Lisa, believe it or not, I started sleeping around with men after that. And I was like, you? Like, whoa. And she said there was something about just what I was going through and the pain and the loss, and it seemed easier, you know. And so it's been interesting to see how for her that fluidity, you know, it's like she's definitely a lesbian. She's definitely more interested in women. But for her, it was like she couldn't bear to be with women at that time. And so it's interesting to see how the normal humanness of loss and hardship intersects with this capacity for change and fluidity that for her gave her a sort of coping mechanism that was kind of unusual, you know, and that I found fascinating.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to which parts of us are we willing to share and with whom, you know?
Yeah.
And how different that would be.
Other lesbian friends know about this? She's like, I don't really talk about it with them. Like,
yeah.
But she's like, but I can tell you because I know that this is what you study. So, yeah.
Wow. You must have some, I mean, I'm just thinking about the relationships you must have with all these women after decades, you know?
It's amazing because, again, it's like I've forgotten what they all look like. So I'm more familiar with like the way they talk and their histories, but it's like if I ran into one of them on the street, I wouldn't know them.
Right. Interesting. So I'm thinking about the people that study, people that work, you know, our human tendency to want to categorize and label and, you know, and it seems like that's at play culturally, right? Is somebody gay? Is somebody straight? Is somebody bisexual? What's it, you know, where do we put them on a scale? So I would imagine there's our professional interest in understanding those categories or.
Well, it's more than professional. I mean, humans are categorizers.
Right.
we know from social and cognitive psychology that the reason that we stereotype is that it would be impossible for our brains to make sense of the world and all of its complexity if we didn't chunk things down.
Right.
Every time, all the time. When you are sitting at your desk, your eyes are focusing on a couple of things and they are graying all the things in your periphery. Because if you're to process every bit of information that's coming in, it would explode. So our brains have to focus and they have to chunk and they have to systematize and reduce things down. And that's a part of what stereotyping is really all about. It doesn't make us bad people. When we categorize, it's because our brains are trying to reduce the massive complexity of the world into meaningful bits. And so that's a very human tendency. And I think the mistake that people make is sort of conflating that human process with natural categories that exist in nature.
Yeah.
Just recognize that we need to categorize people and political movements need to categorize people, but those are human creations. They're not natural types.
Yes.
And as long as we recognize that, then we're okay. Then we can be like, yeah, I can roughly divide people into lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual, and that's useful. It's useful to me scientifically. It's useful to me personally as a lesbian. It's useful politically. But I have to always remember that that's a human projection onto the complexity of the world. I'm not seeing nature as it is. I'm doing some work as a thinking person to chunk the world into meaningful bits.
Yeah. So and let me see if I can articulate this question, because I'm wondering about your subjects' desire to categorize themselves. Like, how much did it come into play that they felt like they needed to identify as something, versus this idea of fluidity, which is maybe there's not a label.
Well, and I think that's a generational thing. I think certainly in the youngest generation of queer folk, they're much more comfortable not having a label and not identifying as anything. That was not necessarily true in the 90s and in the 80s, when it was really important to find a community and to be able to connect with folks who had a shared experience, and identity labels were the way to do that. Now, I think that, there's more acceptance. There's, the internet has allowed people to connect through a variety of sort of different backgrounds. And so I think calling yourself a category isn't as critical to your own kind of personal support and well-being as it used to be. Mm-hmm. So I do think a part of this is sort of a generational change.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are you bringing in new subjects too, younger people, or over time?
Research, but they're not necessarily as young. Like I do other research on adults. But I know folks who do research on youth now, and they find, that the kids are like, should I call myself anything?
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing the same thing with a lot of transgender issues.
Right, which is nice. So did you find that your subjects were generally relieved to discover this concept of fluidity and that there was some explanation for what was going on, or did they feel...
I think they were relieved to find out that they were not the only one. I had participants early on who were like, oh my God, I'm like a really bad example of a whatever I am. And maybe you should take me out of your study. And so I think they were all surprised to find out that their experience was actually pretty common.
Huh.
And it's been interesting because over the years, now that everyone talks about, sexual fluidity, a lot of them, have told me that they feel really proud to be in the study and to have been a part of this kind of change in the conversation. And that means so much to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you want listeners to take away from your research, to date from our conversation?
What I often tell folks is that we often, we talk a lot about the stigma that queer people face. And I think we all do a lot of stigmatizing of ourselves. We project our own abnormalness onto ourselves. And I think one of the things we've learned from sexual fluidity is just, the incredible diversity of the human condition. That's true for race. That's true for gender. That's true for sexuality. And I think the more that we can have a more open and accepting approach to all of these human categories and feel less compelled to live up to some idea of how we're supposed to be, the happier we are. The hallmark of humans as a species is our adaptability and our flexibility. So it shouldn't surprise us that we are flexible and adaptive when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to race and ethnicity, when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to gender. And if we can just sort of adopt this approach of being more forgiving of ourselves and of one another when we don't fit what we think is expected, I think that would make a lot of people much happier.
Yeah. Yes, it would. I hope lots of people get that message. So where can people learn a little bit more about you? I don't know if you've got a website or if there's, where they can get information about your studies.
University kind of gives me a website and I can be contacted there. And people ask me questions all the time. And I'm totally happy to talk about these issues. So, I'm a professor at the University of Utah. So if you just type in to Google Lisa Diamond, Utah, university website, and I think I have some of my articles posted up there. And
that would be interesting. Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing about this. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. It's been a lot of fun.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question and answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.